Hello, and welcome back to the NOTCAST. If this is your repeat episode, if this is your first one, well, welcome. Glad you found me. It is Sunday, the 19th of November, 2023. This is number 335. Good God, that's a big number, isn't it? And today I'm talking about a record that, unlike my previous 7 episodes, isn't 30 years old. When I looked at my previous recent uploads, and I kind of realized the stuff I'd done was 1977, 1973, 1988. I kind of felt quite old, really, because I did. And this one I'm talking about today, David Bowie and his penultimate studio record, The Next Day, released in March 2013, only 10 years old. So by some standards, still relatively new, although, of course, not by everyone's. And 10 years, it doesn't seem like it's a long time ago. I remember 10 years ago very, very vividly, but not everybody does. And it is, to be fair, a decade in the rearview mirror. The other thing is, as a content creator, although I hate that phrase, content creator, I'm just a dude talking to his phone about things that he likes. I do these whenever I feel like it, about whatever I want to. And if you have any suggestions about anything you'd like to hear me talk about, do put something in the comments. And if you don't, trust me, it's going to be a long time till I run out of all my records and my CDs and my gigs to think about. But I do it whenever I feel like it. And sometimes an idea kind of comes into the focus in my mind. And I kind of go, today it's going to be about, and then it's about whatever it is that my mind is focused on. So maybe, according to some people, I'm either autistic or I have ADHD or something like that. I kind of super hyper focus on certain things for certain periods of time. And I kind of go, I'm going to go real deep undercover into this, whatever this subject matter, whatever this thing is. And then it kind of becomes something that I kind of pursue almost obsessively for a period of time. And actually the NOTCAST is really, really good for me because it allows me to focus on things which maybe at the time I kind of passed by or overlooked or experienced, but I didn't really dig deep into at the time. And so this allows me to go back and revisit parts of history which perhaps I didn't pay as much attention to at the time as I probably should have done. And that allows me to rediscover things that already exist that I know I already like. Hopefully it will also do the same for you. Although, of course, if you've not been listening to Bowie's The Next Day quite a lot over the past 10 years, what the hell have you been doing? It's really bloody good. And if you have, then excellent, but sorry, there's not many more new David Bowie songs to experience. So start off chronologically with what happened before The Next Day came out. 2010 saw the release of the Super Mega Deluxe box sets of Station to Station. Or maybe it was 2011. And with that came a single, the Golden Years KCRW remixes, where I think DJs from KCRW, the radio station, remixed the track. And I have no memory whatsoever of what these remixes are like. They could be atrocious. I'm not sure. But this was David Bowie effectively as a museum piece, kind of merchandising his own past and his own legacy. And his absence was incredibly successful, of course. Whereas I think some people's absences, you kind of go, well, they washed up and they died out and they just ran out of things to say. With Bowie, the idea was actually that you can very clearly see that, unlike some artists, naming no names, he didn't go old and crap and put out an album where you kind of listen to it and go, what's the point of doing that? When you get to that age, you kind of go, well, if I'm going to make an album that's going to be a year, 2 years out of my life, and if you're 80, you kind of look at that and go, that's probably about the next 25% of my time on the planet. Is it worth it? Especially if you don't believe in the album or you're making it out of habit. Records don't sell enough. So if you make a record these days, you have to believe in it and you have to trust it. And so when it was released, The Next Day was this unexpected gift from David. Talking about him like I know him in his first day. No, absolutely not. Which not even the label knew existed until October 2012. So when it was released in March 2013, it really was quite a surprise to quite a lot of people, including myself. I figured he was just sitting at home, reading books, watching films, buying art, and just generally really, really enjoying his time on the planet, being this guy called David that used to sing, but of course still did. So, start off of the album, the first kind of fruits of it, started with demos that were recorded in a studio at Manhattan 618 in November 2010. and then recording, I think, started in Crosby Street Magic Shop in May 2011 to October 2012. When David was putting together his band to back him on these, he sent an email to band members, and its name was Stum, as in keep stum, keep quiet. And they had a code name for the record. It was never called The Record. It was either called The Secret or The Table. And apparently Tony Visconti, who produced some of the tracks on the album, if not all of them, and David were emailing, go 2 weeks until The Secret, until the thing that they'd been working on that nobody knew was really happening suddenly came to the public eye. The time before it had been a time of, I think, historical revisionism, and not necessarily in a bad way, but as people get older, myself included, you start to then think about your past, the things that you've done in the years before you got to this point here. How did they inform you? What decisions did you make? Were they good ones or bad ones? Where are we now? And who are you going to be? And David had become effectively managing somebody who was managing his own legacy. He had the most successful retirement I can think of. People had begun to cherish him again because they'd missed him, whereas in 2000, 2001, 2002, 2003, 2004, he was very public, very visible. It was just like, well, if we don't like that, there's another one coming in 2 years' time anyway. Whereas having the absence, suddenly realised what you'd had right in front of you the whole time. So that cliche about absence makes the heart go fonder. It's not necessarily true, but in this case, it certainly did seem to help. And it was evolved from a number of songs. So David had been quietly, I think, writing in the background without an agenda, without an idea that there'd be an album, but I'm just going to write some songs, and when I think I've got enough songs for an album, then that's the place it'll be, and those are the songs. And there was no pressure to release them, no financial incentive to do them. Nobody was thinking, oh, isn't it about time he stuck out a new album? So there was, I mean, that's where you actually can create the best art without an expectation of commercial or critical kind of acclaim. Is you just make the best thing that you can to reflect who you are and where we are at any given point in time. First and foremost, I have to talk about the record sleeve, because that is the first thing that most people saw. It's the first Bowie LP which didn't have his face on. It didn't have a contemporary picture of him on it. It's almost as if he'd reflecting his absence from reality, his kind of step away from fame and fortune. I think the only other album that didn't have his photograph on the front was possibly Tin Machine 2, although obviously there was the 4 stone statues that represented the various band members. That was also a band that wasn't a David Bowie solo LP. So this is the first album that David released that didn't have a contemporary image or photograph or representation of himself on the cover. And what they did is, with the release strategy, this was also one of the very first surprise LPs that was released. Beyonce and so on, and 9 Inch Nails kind of have done those also. The idea of an album that you didn't even know existed, that suddenly is in your inbox, that you can download and you can access and listen to, that you weren't expecting. Unlike the heavily trailed and therefore highly disappointing Chinese Democracy, depending on your point of view. I really like Chinese Democracy, but not everybody does. What we had was an album that nobody was expecting, that fit into the surprise release strategy, and that then focused on the art itself. There was no interviews, there was no touring, no television appearances. It sidestepped all the usual media hubbub which you would expect around, interviews and appearances on television, podcasts and things like that. There was just the record. That's all there was. That was a complete artistic statement from David, the only thing that existed. And what they'd had, certainly some other artists around his age had kind of done textured photos, or they'd kind of taken old photos of themselves, or they'd retouched them to kind of hide the effects of aging. So think about Paul McCartney, Neil Young, Eric Clapton's dreadful album, which is called Old Shoe. And if you have an album called Old Shoe, you shouldn't have an album called Old Shoe. You should stop making records in embarrassment, because what a fucking awful name for an album that is. You might as well call it I've Got No Bloody Ideas. But people like Paul McCartney and Neil Young had taken to modifying their appearance on the album covers, so contemporary photos, whereas David Bowie sidestepped that completely and effectively obliterated his face, allowing him to grow old in public, but not necessarily in a way that was to draw attention to it. And I think the other thing around it is that it was the art was presented in a way that took obviously the well-known cover of the Heroes album, and then just covered that in a block of white text, as if to say that version of David Bowie, the one that you're familiar with, the one that you think exists, doesn't exist. This is a different version of it. This is what happens the next day. So when somebody retires from the public eye, let's think about the last scene of Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade with Indy and Sean Connery and the other chap whose name I've forgotten. Sorry, man. Kind of riding off into the sunset. There's always well, what happens the next day? Well, you go to wherever it is you're going to sleep, and you have a dinner. You have wine. You laugh about, my God, we just saw the Holy Grail. We just killed a bunch of Nazis. We just saw people getting their faces melted off by the angels of death coming out of the Ark of the Covenant. That kind of stuff. There's always the next day, which is always going to be an anti-climax. And the next day as an album kind of addresses that kind of sense of, well, this is what happens next. After you've withdrawn from the public eye or after some event has happened, there is a next day until one day there isn't. And I think it's inspired by a statement from Mick Ronson in an interview in 1993 when he was dying of cancer. And he said, the doctors tell me I shouldn't be here. I don't go to chemotherapy anymore. I just put one foot in front of the other and you do your best. You're going, that's the next day. It's after facing health scares, you just carry on. Or as the Pet Shop Boys had in the track single Bilingual, you're going out and you're carrying on as normal. The next day is an album about what happens after that. Because life still goes on. There's still, spaghetti and gas bills. So there's no like grand and triumphant moment. Think about the biographies or the biopics that there are of people. There's or the music documentaries. It normally opens with that moment of incredible triumph. The artist or the athlete on the podium with the gold medal or in front of the massive crowd, gazing and basking in adulation. And then it's a hard cut to the next day when they're sat there eating breakfast and having cornflakes and need to change the cat litter. Those type of things, as is very obviously seen in the LCD Sound System documentary Play the Hits, is it does follow the James Murphy on the next day after LCD split up, and that's what the next day is. It's kind of, well, what happens next? Because it still carries on, or as somebody says, life goes on until it doesn't, which is I think what Stanley Pollock said in Eyes Wide Shut. And there was also kind of a tie-in with the title to, of course, the track Heroes. We can be heroes just for one day. Well, what happens after that day passes? And then that ties in with the cover art that we've got of the Heroes album here, with its kind of cover being obliterated by a white block of text, which is bold, imaginative, and it says very clearly, this isn't what you think it is. This is a different version of David. The version of David that exists in your mind no longer exists. Now, I don't like the cover to this album. I think the concept is absolutely 100% sound. I think the imagery is perhaps a little too on the nose. I have mocked up alternate versions of the cover, which I'm going to show to you now because I'm arrogant and big-headed. This is the version of the Next Day cover, which, oh, and by the way, fact fans, that is Scott there from Frightened Rabbit. God bless him. So that's the cover which I put and mocked up for the Next Day, and that takes the Q cover photo from 1993, where they'd put on, against David's wishes, the slash from the cover of Aladdin Insane, or Aladdin Sane. And I then took that, and then I covered that with that white block of text there. And the reason I covered it with the white blocks of text was to indicate that the version of David Bowie that people thought existed, but never actually existed, i.e. the 1993 version of David that had the Aladdin Sane slash over the top of the face, was being obliterated by the actual reality. And also this exists, or at least I chose this, because 1973 was the year for Aladdin Sane, 1993 was the year for the photo, 2013 was the year of the release of the Next Day, and therefore it represented three things, each 20 years apart in the 40-year career up to that point of David. The other cover, which I mocked up, is this one here, which is a photograph taken from his visit to Mexico in 1996. And the photo is obviously of him looking into the ceiling, taken in an art gallery in Mexico. But if you look, the angle of his face there and the angle of one of the people that's represented there are the same. It almost feels as if they're an extension of each other, and Bowie's life itself being a work of art. Both of those, I think, are good covers. and I like them, but that's just purely an aesthetic thing. I was just looking at the cover of The Next Day one day and going, if I was going to do it, how would I do it differently? And by the way, it's a fantastic cover, irrespective of my big-headed attempt to change it. It's still a very, very good cover indeed. So let's talk through the construction of the LP here. This was released in a number of formats. Here's a double vinyl edition from 2013. There was an expanded edition called The Next Day Extra, which contained 2 CDs and a DVD. There were a number of different CD versions that came out in its first release as well. So there was a deluxe version with extra tracks, a Japanese version with another extra track, and then obviously The Next Day Extra covered all of those extra tracks, plus some extra tracks. There is a test. I will fail it. So, writing quietly at home without the pressure of expectation from anybody else. The Next Day was, as I said, first demoed in Manhattan in November 2010, and then he pulled his band together to play the songs live in the studio. 2 songs a day, 1 in the morning, 1 in the afternoon, doing 2 to 5 takes of the track, and then maybe kind of selecting one of those. So playing them live in the studio, maybe a maximum of 5 times each. And that was, I think, at Crosby Street Magic Shop between May 2011 and October 2012. And the reason that they changed the studio was because somebody with loose lips that sinks ships had let somebody else know that there was a recording artist by the name of David Bowie in the studio. They decided to move away from that because they didn't want anybody knowing they were working on it, because if somebody had found out they were working on it, then the expectation is that there is going to be a record that's going to be released. And sometimes the best art is created in the mind and for the consumption of the artist, and is then kind of sent out into the world once it's been completed. Whereas if somebody knows you're recording an album, the expectation is always, well, I guess we're going to have some hits. And sometimes you need to make records where the only expectations are the best that you can do and not what anybody else is expecting from it. This album was, like a lot of Bowie albums, but possibly the most obvious one so far, is Bowie as an observer, watching the world around him, commenting on the world that he had effectively withdrawn from, and passing judgment upon its shortcomings and shortfalls. So starting off with the demos, there were a number of tracks which were recorded first. So Atomica, Dancing, where is it? What's it called? Dancing Out in Space, Boss of Me, Heat, How Does the Grass Grow, The Next Day, If You Can See Me. I really should have taken some notes down, shouldn't I? I'm trying to do this all off memory and failing completely. And then there was a second set of sessions in September 2011 where The Boss of Me, God Bless the Girl, The Informer, So She, Where Are We Now, and a track called Plaid were put together. And that was in September 2011. And then March 2012 to May 2012 saw recordings of Dirty Boys, She's So High, I'll Take You There, UFO, The Next Day, Fire, and actually additional recordings and finalisation of previous recordings as well. So the album wasn't done in one big go. It was kind of built together out of 3 separate sessions, 3 separate demo versions. And because each version of the album has a slightly different track listing, the CD, the LP, the deluxe edition CD, the Japanese edition CD, and the Next Day Extra. It's a very postmodern LP in so much as there is no one definitive edition of the album. Each version of the album has a different track listing. It has a core kind of constituent 13 tracks, which ends on, and let me just quickly guess, Heat. And then there's the LP has an extra 7 tracks. The CD has a total of something like 20 or so. And the various CD editions also add that up. So there's no definitive version of The Next Day, which ties in with the idea that it's all open to interpretation. This isn't a definitive artist statement. This is a compilation of work that's been collated over a series of time that's presented in a certain format, as opposed to a definitive grand statement. And so let's go. Track 1, well, more correctly, the first track that we heard is Where Are We Now? And that was released as a surprise on Bowie's birthday, as a video and as a download, quietly appearing without any announcement on iTunes. Side 2, track 1 of the LP. It did get a physical release as a single in April 2013 in America, so I don't have a copy of that because, as my accent will tell you, I am not American. Where are we now is oh, it's a gorgeous song. I adore it. It's one of my very favourite Bowie tracks, and it's a song that really kind of addresses, well, first off, the passing of time, the move from, you know, parent to child as well, the concepts that sit inside that. And Where Are We Now is the opening text that appears on the screen in the first shot of Duncan Jones's film Moon. Duncan Jones being David Bowie's son, also at one point known as Zowie Bowie, which is a strange name, but there we are. And that is in itself a statement that kind of goes, well, where are we now? What are we doing at this point in time? Who are we going to be? What are we going to be? And so Where Are We Now is, in my opinion, just a spectacular song, one of the very best Bowie songs of all time, if not actually in my top three. One of my top three I've already mentioned. I talked about it when I did the Outside episode, is No Control. The third one is probably Where Are We Now. Number two is on the next record, and I'll let you decide which one that's going to be when we get that far ahead. But Where Are We Now is a song that like a lot of the things that are on the album, it kind of goes back to that concept of history, identity, integrity. Who am I? Where am I? What am I going to be? What am I going to stand for? What am I going to believe? And Berlin was the last place where David Bowie was probably really young, actually, because he was born in, I think, 1949, and so therefore, well, I might have got the year wrong, I can't remember now, but he would have been 30, 32, maybe 28 at the time when he was in Berlin. That's the very last point where you can conceivably say to anyone, well, actually, I'm young and these are youthful hijinks. There comes a point where nothing makes you look older than trying to look younger than you are, and vice versa. And so therefore, if you're still behaving in a certain immature way when you get to a certain age, you kind of go, that's probably outlived its usefulness. So Berlin was the last place where he was really young. He was dealing with the violence of history, the legacy of history, the decisions that have been taken over the years. And there were ideas of agency and identity and self-actualization, which he was exploring. So you could argue that, to an extent, the material up to probably Young Americans or Station to Station is effectively an advanced and articulate juvenilia. Whereas when it came to Berlin, that was probably where he was on the cusp of transforming into maturity. And then, as we know, maturity represented itself in the form of Tonight, which is the most boring album that David Bowie ever made. But Where Are We Now has this glorious lyric where he talks about just growing up and kind of putting himself in the context of living in Berlin. So had to get the train from Potsdamer Platz. You never knew that I could do that. Naming and shaming the streets and the alleyways where he's been from. So getting in touch with nostalgia, with history, with contact and context, and the idea that, as Bowie said, Berlin was really where it was real, whereas the UK and the USA were fictions, is how he described it. And the idea of aging and losing your place in the world. So the video for Where Are We Now, for example, featuring footage shot of Berlin with projections onto two small dolls of Bowie's face and another person, was the idea of growing old with dignity and understanding your place within the context of history. And the last shots, I think, of the video, which are on the DVD version of the Next Day Extra, features Bowie wearing a t-shirt advertising a film, I think, called The Song of Norway. And The Song of Norway is a film that his first love, Hermione, appeared in and made around about the time that they separated. So it was acknowledgement, a kind of tacit recognition of the passing of time, and the things that you've lost with the passing of time is that you can't go home anymore because there isn't any such thing as home. And so that is Where Are We Now? That question of asking, well, what is my place on this planet? Apart from the fact that obviously we're all ghosts driving meat skeletons, sitting on a ball of rock orbiting a huge ball of fire that's 93 million miles away. That's the happy version of it. But kind of just asking the questions around identity and agency and making sure that you put that in the right and correct context. The second track that was released from the album was The Stars Are Out Tonight. And so that is why Where Are We Now and The Stars Are Out Tonight became the first single that was released in America. And The Stars Are Out Tonight is the third song on the album. And because it was the second one that was heard, I think that probably kind of followed up with the idea that it's not just a flash in the pan here. Now, Stars Are Out Tonight is pretty good. Melodically, it's very strong. Ideal second single choice. But it kind of talks about the concept of existing in the public eye. So when Bowie had rejected and moved away from the public eye, he effectively existed more as a kind of like a celebrity husband. When Iman went to, I don't know, award ceremonies or launching of charities or things like that, Bowie was there in his role as a husband, but he wasn't himself kind of saying anything. He was a mute icon. And as the Manics said on their t-shirt in 1996, mute icons are the only acceptable form of beauty today. So it effectively kind of absented himself from the concept of stardom. Some people see stardom as an end to itself. The only thing that really matters is that you get to be successful. It's like, well, what are you famous for? Doesn't matter, I just want to be famous. And actually sometimes you've got to take a step back and go, if you're not famous for something, you're famous for nothing. You know, you've got to have a thing. And so David kind of became a tabula rasa upon which people were able to present and project their own interpretations around the ideas around it. And it's influenced by a statement by Mishima, which is that, and his statement is, human life is limited and I want to live forever. The idea of being a star gives you a sort of form of immortality, a version of you that exists out in the ether that has no relation to the actual version of you that does exist. And when David kind of absented himself from the public eye by not doing interviews and not doing tours and not doing photo shoots very much, but just kind of just presenting the album as it is, you then kind of looked at it and went, so really we're projecting onto this blank canvas the ideas that we have, whether they are right or whether they are wrong. But of course, as we know, nothing which David did was quick or slapdash. There's always a degree of thought to it. Even the super sincere stuff like Be My Wife or Wild Is the Wind, you just kind of go, even though that's sincere, that's a conscious decision to be sincere as opposed to actually just sincere, if that makes sense. And the album came out on the 8th of March 2012, and so let's go to the album. And in fact, the first song on the album is The Next Day, which was released as a 7-inch single on, amongst many other things, a square 7-inch picture disc. God, isn't this nice? This is quite sexy, actually. There's a bit of art. I mean, what we can say is the design of The Next Day period is absolutely spectacular. Is that you have the song here on a square 7-inch piece of white vinyl, yeah, I mean, it's just, you know, no identifying marks whatsoever. It could be anything, actually. So there we have it. And The Next Day is the first song on the album. It's kind of a response, I think, to a track by the Flaming Lips called Is David Bowie Dying, which was released in 2011. And the response to that is kind of like, here I am, not quite dying, my body left to rot in a hollow tree. The concept of going, here I am, I'm not quite dying. You shouldn't be listening to anybody else, you should be listening to me. And it's around a defiant old age. So that statement about rage against the dying of the light, etc., etc. The idea that growing old doesn't have to mean becoming bland or mediocre or boring or anything like that, although some of you undoubtedly watch this and go, yeah, Mark's old and he's boring. Well, it's my kind of interesting. It's not everybody's kind of interesting. The Next Day was that a kind of refutation of how age having to necessarily bring with it a series of ideas around, you know, mediocrity, tedium, and being unexciting. It was a refutation about that, and it was about him placing himself in the legend and going, here I am, I'm not quite dying. I'm kind of carrying on as it is. And obviously, first track, side one, track one, the first song which most people would have heard from the LP, it really kind of very clearly says and pins its colours to the mast and makes it absolutely clear that this is something where David Bowie is going, I'm here, I exist, on the album. And so the lyric that sits in there is, well, it's defiant, isn't it? And the song kind of strides out. So you imagine this would be great live. You play it live, second song in the set, but it would work completely and brilliantly as the second song. And then track 2 is Dirty Boys. And Dirty Boys was, I think, built out of a jam. It was instinctive, the way it was created, and then it was edited and shaped. It's a song that really is kind of looking at and observing the lives and the loves of other people. Bowie kind of going from transmit to receive, and then passing on his observations on the flawed human race, like some kind of alien reporting back whether we're worth invading or not. And the lyric is difficult for me to describe, really, because it's so much about kind of, well, you know, when you're young and you don't quite know who you are or what you are or what you're going to be, who are you going to belong to or with, what's that role going to be in future, is really what Dirty Boys, I think, to me is about. And the 5 songs actually, in fact most of the album has a lyrical obsession with identity, agency, belonging, history, and it runs through all of these songs like a stick of rock. Number 3 being The Stars Are Out Tonight, which of course I've already mentioned, the concept of existing in the public eye as a mute icon and people projecting onto you things which aren't necessarily the case. Track 4 on the album is a stone dead, absolute Bowie classic. Easily one of my favourite tracks of his. Undoubtedly, it is Love Is Lost. Love Is Lost was released as a single. I think it was the 4th single that came out from the album, the last single that came out from the album, and it was released on a 12-inch. Here it is. I think it's white vinyl of Love Is Lost. Side A is a Hello Steve Reich mix by James Murphy of LCD Sound System. The B-side is the Venetian mix of I'd Rather Be High and an edit of Love Is Lost. This is one of the best remixes that there is. It's just a fantastic track, and probably would have been if you were programming a David Bowie set list for the Next Day tour, this would probably be the first track, actually, because it's kind of like him introducing himself to the world with lyrics around you're 22 and your accent is new and say hello, hello, hello. You could really see it kind of opening up a live show and being just a mind-blowingly great introduction. But the idea of that lyric there, making it very, very clear, and in the darkest hour, you're 22, the voice of youth, the hour of dread, the darkest hour, and your voice is new. Love is lost, lost is love. Your country's new, your friends are new, your house and even your eyes are new. Your maid is new and your accent too, but your fear is as old as the world. What incredible lyrics, actually. And you think about at the age of 22, that was the time when David split with Hermione. The period that's referenced in Where Are We Now in the video, and he's wearing the Song of Norway clothing. But there's also the idea of being at 22 is that concept of wasted youth. The idea of going, well, you don't quite know who you are. You don't quite know who you're going to be. Who can I be now? And kind of growing into and becoming that person. And there's the idea of love as something which is unclear, and you don't quite know what love is going to be. Now, if you think about Love's Labour's Lost, for example, in some people's eyes, love could be seen as a disability or as a weakness. But here it absolutely isn't. It's more around you're discovering new things. This is who I can be. And if you've ever fallen in love, aren't you lucky? I have. I think I've been in love 4 times in my life. And at least 3 of those times have been incredible experiences, that made me feel that what I'd experienced was profound and powerful and life-changing. And one time was just bloody awful because of the way that it ended, which is a shame. But the other 3 times were incredible experiences that I kind of sat there going, I literally cannot believe that this thing I'm experiencing, these emotions, these circumstances, are real because they're so wonderful. Or as Prince said, feels so good it must be a crime. So Love Is Lost is one of the most amazing Bowie tracks ever, and I strongly recommend it. Absolutely love it. Obviously I wish he'd toured, I wish he'd lived, I wish so many other things had happened, but wow, what a way to grow old, is to grow old and to not go crap and rubbish and boring and to re-record an old album and do a terrible job of it. What a fantastic kind of piece of work those last few years absolutely were. And then of course side 2 of the album turning it over there, Where Are We Now, which I've talked about previously. And then we have Valentine's Day, which is track 6. And Valentine's Day was released as a single. Here is a 7-inch of it that's backed with Plan. At least I think it's Plan. It's a picture disc that features a close-up of just his hand and has the lyrics presented on there. And again, what a fabulous piece of design that 7-inch is, that kind of white sleeve with just the lyrics on. It's minimal, clean, uncluttered, very tasteful in a very good way. So as you get older, you kind of trim away from your life the things that don't really look like you anymore, and the clean lines and the minimalism of the LP kind of reflects that idea of breaking down or reducing what is to the very bare, basic, absolutely essential core things that you need to have, which is maybe I'm overreading it, but that's how I feel when I look at things like the artwork to Valentine's Day. There's no extraneous information that's on there whatsoever. Valentine's Day has a huge role in the Bowie musical, Lazarus, which I will talk about in the next time I talk about Bowie, where it's recast as a killer. But it's got a video that was shot in a now either demolished or disused grain farm in New York with a headless guitar that looks like a gun, as he sings about the idea of a gang and murder and the sense of being on the precipice of something enormous that's about to happen. Great track, undoubtedly. If You Can See Me is song 7. I don't have strong opinions about this. It's got a Gail and Dorsey vocal on it, reminiscent of the recording and construction of Outside and Leon. It's okay. It doesn't blow my mind, sorry to say. And then there's I'd Rather Be High, which is track 8. I'd Rather Be High is also, I think, the B-side of Love Is Lost in a slightly different remixed form. And it's a song that's around the timelines of history. It's about memory, image, reality, around all these things kind of collapsing in on each other as time itself becomes an abstract concept. And so, you know, the lyric that's in there around I'd rather be high, I'd rather be flying, I'd rather be dead. I'd rather be out of my head than training these guns on these men in the sand. The Thames was black, the tower was dark. You know, these type of lyrics where it's talking about actually the collapse of history, and a lot of the imagery that's on the album is linked to things like the military conflict, history, politics, kind of observing dispassionately this world that seems to be spinning out of control as mankind kind of eats itself in some kind of huge capitalist, cannibalistic kind of approach. And it's just a wonderful song. But there's a distinct break in the album when we get to about track 9. And after track 9 is called The Boss of Me, by the way, which takes its name from the Boss ME80 effects pedals, which I think Old Slick was using during recording. The rest of the songs on the album feel like they're not lesser, but they feel less vital, less immediate. You know, a song like Dancing Out of Space, or Dancing Out in Space, is actually very, very minor. It's very insubstantial. You know, if you'd had the album that had gone up to High, track 8, and then maybe thrown in as the last 2 songs, You Feel So Lonely, You Could Die in Heat, you'd have an absolutely stellar 10-track LP. Whereas it stands, you've got something like 21 songs over the course of the albums. And those make for, in the oldie days, that would be, you know, 11 or 12 songs plus 10 B-sides. But with the singles as physical objects, aside from these vinyl editions being largely, you know, irrelevant, things like CD singles didn't really exist anymore. And so therefore, the extra tracks didn't become B-sides, they just became extra songs, like deleted scenes on a Blu-ray or a DVD of the next day. And we had track 12, which is, well, track 11 is How Does the Grass Grow, which is a song about gun control. So it deals with the concepts of soft and hard power in terms of, for example, soft power, things like cultural influences. Hard power is tanks rolling over the border, for example. And we have The World Is on Fire, or You Will Set the World on Fire, which is a song about ambition destiny, and the lyrics to that kind of betray the concept of, well, what's it like to be young and ambitious and to want to change the world and to adapt the world to your own way of thinking, and to make things be a little bit different. Not great at all. And then we have You Feel So Lonely You Can Die, which is one of those songs around aging and the loss of friends, the thinning out of people that you know. And there's an epidemic of loneliness amongst older people as you don't go out so much. Your friends kind of scatter over the country, you see less of them, the relationships that you have are less important, the friendships that you do have, the ones that are really good, they start to fracture or die, or whatever else happens, and then it becomes a very kind of miserable and depressing way to look at it, although I try not to think about it quite in the context of how that's going to work. And then we have Heat, which is the last song on the original CD release, and as far as I'm concerned, the last song really on the next day. Everything that comes after Heat is a bonus track. It kind of touches upon the concept of identity and control, which are themes around identity, expectation, perception, which were themes which were obviously touched upon, as I said, by Mishima, Scott Walker, who was a huge influence on David, and other people. Is the idea around being absent and present, the idea of being there and not there, and the idea of creating and manipulating the reality to reflect what you want it to be. That chorus around My Father Ran the Prison, for example. The lyric is where he says, I can only love you by hating him more. That's not the truth. It's too big a word. He believed that love is theft, the theft of love, and I tell myself I don't know who I am, but I'm a seer and a liar, and my father ran the prison. What a strange way to end an album, really. But at the same point, you kind of think about, well, actually, we all are our father's sons, and we're all the sons of fathers, and we're fathers to people, or, well, I am. Other people are, undoubtedly, and some of you watching this almost definitely are, I think. And so the idea of that passing over of the baton to the next generation, to the children, and to kind of go, this is now your reality and what you do with it. And the concept of my father ran the prison. You kind of think, thinking about history, actually, and I've thought about this, is, if you're the child of a father who's either absent or awful, if your dad ran a concentration camp, for example, what would your relationship be like to that? What would your memories be like of that? Well, if you were growing up and your childhood memories were this loving, caring man, and then actually you read that he thought nothing of shooting people from a guard tower, for example, and you kind of go, that's not the father I knew. That's not the one who I saw. And then you think about the aspects of a personality there, and how that all kind of collapses into identity and reality and realism. And it's some heavy shit. We'll put it that way. And not everybody can get on with that. It's a weird and depressing way to end an album. Not a bad way to end an album, by the way, but a strange note to put on your first record in 10 years. And that is the only photo of David that's in the cover art there. Black and white, highly stylized, not retouched, but kind of just making him seem less present than he actually is. Just a disembodied head or an intellect as opposed to a body. Right, bonus track time. Here we go. So the LP has 3 bonus tracks on. So She, Plan, and I'll Take You There. So She is okay, mostly forgettable. Plan is an instrumental. It's an early version of a track that's called The Informer, that's on the Next Day Extra EP. And I'll Take You There is, well, just another song. And then on the Japanese edition of the CD, there was an extra track called God Bless the Girl. And God Bless the Girl was a shoe-in, I think is a technical phrase, a lock for the expanded, for the LP running order, right up until very, very late in the day when it got bumped. But David didn't want it to become lost, so God Bless the Girl got a release on the Japanese CD of the next day. And we had the singles as well, so we had Love Is Lost, The Next Day, Valentine's Day, and then about 10 years ago this month, either late October or early November, we had the Next Day Extra, an expanded CD DVD edition of the album, a deluxe box set. And this is my preferred configuration of the album, by the way, because it focuses on the cover there as just text. You don't have to live with the conceptions that sit around heroes. It has a number of extra tracks on a bonus CD which haven't been released previously, so Atomica, The Informer, Like a Rocket Man, Born in a UFO are on there as well, and those are really good tracks. Atomica it feels somewhat anonymous when you listen to the tracks, but then Bowie can't help but input his own or import his own vision of himself that sits in there. So you kind of listen to it and go, well, who is it? And I must admit, this is the last album that David recorded with his with his final live band. And I thought that version of the live band, whilst good, were unexciting. I would have preferred David to have worked with more exciting musicians. In an alternate universe, he would have rung Alan Wilder, and Alan would have made these amazing instrumental songs, and then David would have sung these phenomenal tracks over them, and everyone would have been like, that's fucking genius. But it didn't happen. We got this instead, and these are really, really good. And I can't live in the ifs and buts and halibuts kind of world. I have to live in the world that actually existed. So I'm really pleased with this stuff. But there is an element of some of them being kind of ish, B-sides-ish, and Atomica is one of those. We have The Informer as well, which, according to some reports, was inspired by a fabulous movie called In Bruges. And having been to, having not been to In Bruges, but having loved the film, it's a film about two assassins that work in the criminal underworld in Ireland. One played by Colin Farrell, who deeply screws up and then finds himself in the unusual position of being effectively exiled to Bruges. Whilst the mess that he's caused is slowly unravelled and sorted out, and it's funny and it's witty and it's dark and it's all the things. It's the type of film you watched it and go, yeah, it's a David Bowie film, he'd like that. And then we have Rocket Man, which of course takes its title from an Elton John track, and it's part a rip-off, part homage. But it does feel like to some extent it's almost like a statement around what would have happened if reality had turned out differently for certain people. So if, let's say, you were David Bowie and you'd ended up just being a piano player, for example, or as Elton John's album, I think it's called Don't Shoot Me, I'm Only the Piano Player, I think. There's a lyric which kind of suggests here that what you've done is only one of the many, many different lives that you could have lived there. It's a B-side, not a bad B-side, very good B-side, but it's just a B-side. And then in the Next Day Extra, we also have, alongside the Next Day and the extra discs, you have a third disc which wonderfully calls itself Light, and that's just the videos, the 4 promotional films that we have for the 4 videos that were released. So Where Are We Now, and The Next Day, The Stars Are Out Tonight, and Valentine's Day. And effectively the video to Valentine's Day is the last retail visual of David that you can buy. Everything else is on YouTube, and it then just kind of disappears out. We have a booklet called Language, which is in here, which features the lyrics that are presented excitingly. We have a second booklet called Frame, which is photographs from the recording of the album, which presents again slightly different versions of reality. So that's a frame from one of the videos. We have stills from Valentine's Day there, photographs from the recording of the LP, adaptations. That's quite a good cover actually, isn't it? That would make a good cover to The Next Day. There's I think Tilda Swinton and David. I think that's the video for The Stars Are Out Tonight. I haven't seen that for a few weeks. And again, just representations of what a life could have been like. And you just get this sense of an artistic statement about the reality that he was living in at the time. The retail CD had a fold-out 4-panel poster, 6 panels actually, which effectively presented this on one side and the lyrics to the album on the other. And then finally, and this is a cheeky little thing, you had a booklet that just said you, and it was completely blank. you could write in that whatever your impressions are, because effectively it's saying not only is the album and the extra and the light and the language and the visuals part of it, the part of the equation that really matters is not that, it's the person who is experiencing the album. It's the interpretations that they provide to the record. That's the thing that matters, actually. Everything else is just presentations. The interpretation is at least as important as the representation and the presentation of the core art, which is why I think The Next Day is absolutely one of the better David Bowie LPs. So we have a few other things that I think we're going to talk through. Just one more, actually, which the Record Store Day EP released in, and let me just quickly check, 2022, so 9 years ago, the David Bowie Next Day Extra vinyl release. So this contains the songs that aren't on the double LP vinyl edition of The Next Day, being Atomica, the remix of Love Is Lost, The Informer, the remix of I'd Rather Be High, Like a Rocket Man, Born in a UFO, and God Bless the Girl. And if you're a David Bowie aficionado, then this is an essential part of the story. This is effectively a missing LP. Now, you could have made The Next Day as 2 albums. You could have made it as 2 separate releases, like, I don't know, Use Your Illusion 1 or 2, or Load and Reload. Sorry to swear at you like that. But that's not what happened. Is that The Next Day became 1 album, and it became a slightly too long album as opposed to 2 separate records. But then if it had been made 5 years before, when singles existed, people would have taken those songs, put them on B-sides, and not given them the slightest bit of thought whatsoever. But that's not the world we live in. We live in this other alternate reality, the world where actually a single, such as The Next Day, only has The Next Day itself, and then the same song on the B-side. And that there aren't really B-sides anymore. There's just bonus tracks that are hived off amongst lots of different versions of reality. And that is kind of the Next Day, is because it's a response to reality, the preceding album. And the next album that Bowie would release is again a response to The Next Day and the events that are happening around him there. Every album exists in 2 forms, both the version of it that exists on the day it was released and the culture and the society in which it was created and released, and then the other version, which is the version of reality that exists in history. And of course, Black Star, the next David Bowie album, has that in 2 ways, because there is a version of Black Star that existed for only the 3 or 4 days that it had been released before he died, and the version of Black Star that existed as soon as he died, which then became effectively a museum piece for the band ever since. So that is David Bowie's Next Day, which I think is an absolutely great LP. I really, really like it, and it's a fabulous work of art. I rate it very, very highly indeed. So that is where I'm going to wrap up, really. Not sure when the next one of these is going to be. If you have any suggestions about what you'd like to hear me talk about, or any nice comments, don't forget to put them in the comments box. If you've got nasty comments, they get eaten by a spam filter, and nobody but computers ever see them, just so that you know. So there we have it. Thank you for spending 53 minutes with me if you've made it to the end. And if you've only watched a few minutes of it, you probably won't be watching this part, so it doesn't matter what I say, does it? But it does, because the internet never ever forgets. So with that, I'm going to wrap up The Next Day. Thank you very much for watching, and goodbye.